London, April 1925. In a smoky Treasury office overlooking Whitehall, Winston Churchill dipped his pen into ink and signed a single order, a decision he believed would restore Britain's greatness. Instead, it would condemn millions to unemployment, crush entire industries, ignite the largest labour strike in British history, and help destabilise the global economy. A return to the gold standard. At a pre-war exchange rate Britain could no longer afford. A decision meant to bring back glory that instead brought Britain to its knees. This is the story of how nostalgia, elite pressure, and economic illusion sealed Britain's economic fate and set the stage for the Great Depression. The Britain that emerged from the Great War was not the Britain that had entered it. 800,000 men lay dead in foreign soil, their names carved into monuments that lined village greens from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. The nation that had once commanded the world's oceans, dictated its trade routes, and backed its currency with the full weight of empire, now found itself drowning in debt, its industries hollowed out, its workers exhausted, its confidence shattered. The war had cost Britain nearly £40 billion, money borrowed from America, money that would have to be repaid in gold or its equivalent. The pound sterling, once the undisputed reserve currency of the world, had been knocked from its throne. In New York, in Paris, in the counting houses of global finance, a new question was being whispered. Could Britain ever be what it once was? The nostalgia was suffocating. Politicians spoke endlessly of the world before 1914, as if that golden age could be summoned back through will alone. They remembered when a pound was a pound, when British coal powered the world's factories, when British ships carried the world's goods, when the City of London was the unquestioned financial capital of civilization. They remembered the gold standard, that elegant, mystical system where paper money was anchored to gold, where currencies held stable, where trade flowed smoothly across borders, where the very idea of inflation seemed vulgar and impossible. To these men, gold was not merely a metal, it was order, it was civilization, it was Britain itself. But the world had changed. The industries that had made Britain wealthy, coal, steel, shipbuilding, textiles, now faced fierce competition from America, from Germany, from Japan. British wages were high compared to these rivals. British costs were high. British exports were struggling. The pound, floating freely since the war, had depreciated against the dollar. This made British goods cheaper abroad, easier to sell, but it offended the sensibilities of Britain's elite. A weak pound felt like weakness itself. A weak pound felt like surrender. And so, in the halls of Westminster, in the oak-panelled rooms of the Bank of England, in the private clubs of Mayfair, a consensus began to form. Britain must return to the gold standard. Britain must restore the pound to its pre-war value of 4.86. Britain must, by sheer force of will and financial discipline, reclaim its place in the world. Winston Churchill, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, would be the man to do it. And in doing so, he would make the greatest economic mistake of his life. Churchill did not arrive at the Treasury as an economist. He arrived as a romantic, a historian, a man intoxicated by Britain's past and desperate to secure its future. At 50 years old, he had already lived a dozen lives: soldier, war correspondent, prisoner of war, member of Parliament, First Lord of the Admiralty during the Great War's darkest hours. He had made mistakes before, catastrophic ones. The Gallipoli campaign, which he had championed, had ended in slaughter and his political exile. Now, given a second chance, he was determined to restore not just his own reputation, but Britain's. And he believed, with every fibre of his romantic soul, that the path to greatness ran through gold. The governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, reinforced this belief at every turn. Norman was a peculiar man, mystical almost, prone to nervous breakdowns and long absences abroad. yet utterly convinced of his own monetary wisdom. He wore a pointed beard and a wide-brimmed hat, and he spoke of the gold standard not as an economic policy, but as a moral imperative, a return to natural law. To Norman, floating currencies were chaos, inflation was sin, and gold was the one true anchor of civilized commerce. He had spent years lobbying for Britain's return to gold, and in Churchill he found not a skeptic, but a willing convert. The pressure came from all sides. British creditors, who had lent money during the war, wanted to be repaid in pounds that held their value, not depreciated paper. American bankers, led by the influential J.P. Morgan, made it clear that Britain's creditworthiness depended on returning to gold at the old parity. The aristocracy, the old money, the men who had built fortunes in the Victorian era, yearned for stability, for predictability, for a world that resembled the one they had known before the guns of August shattered everything. They did not see the new world. They saw only the memory of the old one. But one man saw clearly. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant young economist whose ideas would later reshape the world, warned Churchill with growing desperation. Keynes understood what the return to gold would mean. Britain's currency would be overvalued by at least 10%, perhaps more. British goods would be too expensive to sell abroad. Wages would have to be cut to compensate. Unemployment would rise. Industries would collapse. The policy of improving the exchange by 1/10, Keynes wrote, involves a reduction in wages, a reduction in employment, and a deflation of prices. He published essays, gave speeches, pleaded with anyone who would listen. The return to gold, he argued, was not a restoration, but a suicide pact. Churchill read Keynes's warnings. In private moments he expressed doubt. He admitted he did not fully understand the complexities of monetary policy, that he relied on experts, that he sometimes felt lost in the thickets of economic theory. But when he looked across the table at Montague Norman, when he sat in rooms with powerful bankers and industrialists, when he read the newspapers clamoring for Britain's return to greatness, his doubts dissolved. The pull of nostalgia was too strong, the pressure too great, the promise too seductive. In the coal mines of South Wales, a miner named Evan Hughes sat in darkness, chipping at a seam of black rock, breathing in dust that would one day kill him. He did not know Churchill's name. He did not know what the gold standard was. But he knew that coal prices were falling, that his wages were under pressure, that the mine owners were talking about cuts. He knew that something was changing, something beyond his control, and that it would not be good for men like him. Above ground, his wife counted coins that bought less each week. In the small mining town where they lived, shops were closing. Families were hungry. The future felt uncertain. And in London, in the halls of power, men in fine suits congratulated themselves on their wisdom and prepared to chain Britain's economy to a standard it could no longer afford. The debates inside the Treasury were fierce, though they were conducted in the polite language of gentlemen. On one side stood the experts who understood the mechanics of modern economies: Keynes, certain younger economists, some members of the civil service who had studied the data and seen the danger. On the other side stood tradition, prestige, political necessity, and the overwhelming weight of Britain's financial establishment. Churchill, caught between these forces, leaned instinctively toward the latter. The external pressures were immense. The United States, now the world's largest creditor, wanted Britain back on gold because it stabilized international trade and strengthened the dollar's own position. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, led by Benjamin Strong, coordinated closely with Montague Norman, offering support and encouragement. British bondholders, who held vast sums of government debt, lobbied aggressively for a strong pound that would preserve the value of their holdings. The Conservative Party, which Churchill had only recently joined after years as a Liberal, saw the return to gold as a test of fiscal discipline, a rejection of socialist ideas about state control and inflation. To oppose the return was to appear weak, unserious, even unpatriotic. And so, on April 28, 1925, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to announce Britain's return to the gold standard. He spoke with his characteristic eloquence, his voice filling the chamber, his words carefully crafted to inspire confidence. He declared that the return to gold would restore stability, attract international capital, rebuild London's position as the world's financial centre, and prove that Britain remained a great power. He spoke of duty, of tradition, of the wisdom of returning to proven principles. He did not speak of the miners, the factory workers, the exporters, the millions whose livelihoods would be sacrificed on the altar of currency stability. Montague Norman sat quietly in the gallery, satisfaction barely concealed on his thin face. The bankers of the city celebrated with champagne. The Times of London praised the decision as a triumph of sound financial management. In Parliament, opposition was muted. The Labour Party objected, but they lacked the votes and the expertise to mount a serious challenge. Keynes, reading the news, felt a sickening certainty settle over him. He knew what was coming. He sat down and wrote another essay, this one titled "The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill," in which he dissected the decision with surgical precision and predicted with eerie accuracy the disaster that would follow. The announcement was met with immediate consequences. The pound's value was now fixed at $4.86, the same rate as before the war, but Britain's economy was not the same. Its productivity had not increased. Its costs had not decreased. Its competitors had not disappeared. By fixing the pound at this level, Churchill had effectively made every British export 10 to 15% more expensive than it needed to be. A British ton of coal now cost more than a German or American ton. A British ship cost more to build. British textiles, British steel, British manufactured goods, all suddenly priced out of world markets. And in the counting houses, in the factories, in the mines, the reckoning began. The collapse came slowly at first, then with gathering speed. In the months following the return to gold, British exports began to fall. The numbers appeared in government reports as abstract statistics, but behind each number was a factory running at half capacity, a shipping company cancelling orders, a coal mine reducing shifts. The industries that had made Britain the workshop of the world were being strangled by their own currency. Coal felt it first and hardest. British coal had once powered the world, shipped to every continent, burned in furnaces from Buenos Aires to Bombay. But British coal was expensive coal, and now it was even more expensive. German coal, Polish coal, American coal, all could undercut British prices. The mine owners, seeing their profits evaporate, did what they had always done. They demanded wage cuts. The miners, already working in conditions of extraordinary danger and hardship, refused. Why should they pay for a decision made in London by men who had never set foot in a mine? In South Wales, in Yorkshire, in Scotland, the mines became battlegrounds. Owners posted notices. Wages would be cut by 10, 15, 20%. Hours would increase. Conditions would worsen. The miners, organized into powerful unions, met these demands with fury. They had fought in the war, lost brothers and sons, survived the trenches, and come home to find their labor devalued, their sacrifice forgotten. Now they were being asked to accept poverty so that bankers in London could maintain an exchange rate. The injustice of it was unbearable. Unemployment rose steadily. In the industrial north, in the shipbuilding towns of the Clyde, in the steel mills of Sheffield, men who had worked for decades found themselves idle. They stood in queues for relief payments, sold their possessions, watched their children go hungry. The government's response was to insist that wages must adjust, that prices must fall, that the economy must rationalize itself. This was the logic of the gold standard, When your currency is overvalued, your people must become cheaper. Keynes watched the unfolding disaster with a mixture of vindication and horror. He had predicted this, but being right brought no satisfaction. He continued to write, to argue, to plead. "The gold standard," he wrote, "is already a barbarous relic." He explained that clinging to an overvalued currency was forcing Britain into deflation, crushing domestic demand, destroying industries, and impoverishing workers. He argued for flexibility, for adjusting the exchange rate, for prioritizing employment over currency prestige. But his voice was drowned out by those who insisted that any departure from gold would be a betrayal, a surrender, an admission of weakness. Churchill, in the Treasury, began to sense that something was wrong. Reports crossed his desk, showing rising unemployment, falling production, growing labor unrest. He met with industrialists who told him they could not compete. He received delegations from mining districts who described the desperation spreading through their communities. But Montague Norman reassured him. The adjustment, Norman said, would take time. Wages would fall. Efficiency would improve. Britain would emerge stronger, more competitive, more stable. Churchill, still not fully understanding the economic mechanisms at work, chose to believe the man who spoke with such certainty. In a small town in County Durham, a steel worker named Thomas Wright returned home after being laid off. He had worked at the mill for 18 years, since he was a boy of 14. Now, at 32, with a wife and 3 children, he had no income and no prospects. The mill had closed an entire section, unable to sell its steel against cheaper foreign competition. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, staring at his calloused hands, and tried to understand what had gone wrong. He had worked hard, done everything right, believed in his country, and now his country had abandoned him. Across Britain, the same scene repeated itself in countless variations. The return to gold, meant to restore greatness, was instead destroying the lives of ordinary people who had no voice in the decision, no understanding of monetary policy, no power to change their fate. By early 1926, the situation had become untenable. The coal industry was on the brink of collapse. The mine owners, seeing no way forward except wage cuts, issued an ultimatum: accept lower wages and longer hours, or the mines would close. The miners, backed by their union, refused. They would not surrender, they would not starve quietly, and they called on the rest of the British labour movement to stand with them. On May 3, 1926, the Trades Union Congress made a decision that would echo through British history. They called a general strike. It was unprecedented. Nearly 1.7 million workers walked off their jobs in solidarity with the miners. Railway workers, transport workers, dockers, printers, steel workers, builders. The strike paralysed Britain. Trains sat idle in stations. Ships remained in port. Newspapers stopped printing. Factories went silent. It was not a revolution, but it felt like one. It was a confrontation between labour and capital, between workers and elites, between those who produced Britain's wealth and those who controlled it. The government's response was swift and severe. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin declared the strike a challenge to constitutional government, an attempt to coerce the state through industrial action. Churchill, always a man of action, threw himself into the fight with characteristic energy. He helped launch a government newspaper, the British Gazette, to counter what he saw as dangerous propaganda from the strikers. He advocated for using troops to maintain order, for breaking the strike by any means necessary. To Churchill, this was not about wages or working conditions. It was about authority, about who governed Britain. The streets of London became surreal. Middle-class volunteers drove buses and trains, playing at being workers, treating the strike as an adventure. Police clashed with picketers. In mining towns, the atmosphere was tense, desperate. Women stood in lines for food. Children went hungry. Miners, receiving no wages, survived on union funds and community solidarity. The strike lasted 9 days, 9 days that revealed the deep fractures running through British society, the gulf between those who made economic policy and those who suffered its consequences. On May 12th, facing government intransigence, dwindling funds, and the threat of escalating violence, the Trades Union Congress called off the general strike. The miners, feeling betrayed, fought on alone for months, but they were slowly ground down by hunger and desperation. By November, broken and starving, they returned to work on the owners' terms. Wages were cut, hours were extended, the miners had lost, but the scars remained. The strike had revealed something fundamental. The return to gold had not strengthened Britain, it had fractured it. The policy that was supposed to unite the nation behind a common purpose had instead divided it, along class lines, pitting workers against elites, exposing the lie that everyone would benefit from currency stability. The miners would not forget. The labour movement would not forget. And across Britain, millions of ordinary people understood, perhaps for the first time, that the interests of the City of London were not their interests, that financial prestige could be bought with their poverty, that they were expendable in the pursuit of a restored past that could never truly return. Churchill, watching the strike unfold from the windows of the Treasury, felt satisfaction that order had been maintained. But he could not quite shake a nagging doubt. The numbers were still bad. Unemployment was still rising. Exports were still falling. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Keynes's warnings echoed. The years that followed the general strike were years of stagnation and decay. Britain's economy limped along, never quite collapsing, but never recovering either. Unemployment remained persistently high, hovering around 10%, reaching 15% in some regions. The coal industry never recovered its pre-war dominance. Shipbuilding orders dried up. Steel production fell. Entire industrial towns became wastelands of closed factories and idle men. The pound, meanwhile, remained stubbornly overvalued. The mechanism was cruel. To maintain the gold standard, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates high to attract foreign capital and prevent gold from flowing out of the country. High interest rates meant expensive credit, which strangled investment, business expansion, and job creation. Britain was exporting unemployment and importing stagnation. The country was caught in a deflationary trap of its own making, sacrificing its present and future to maintain an exchange rate that served primarily the interests of creditors and the financial elite. The rest of the world watched Britain's struggle with growing alarm. Other nations that had returned to gold, or were considering it, saw the British example and hesitated. Some, like France, returned to gold, but at devalued rates that reflected their actual economic capacity. Others maintained floating currencies, but the damage was spreading. The international gold standard, which had facilitated trade and stability before 1914, now acted as a transmission mechanism for deflation and depression. Countries that tied their currencies to gold found themselves forced to contract their economies, cut government spending, and accept unemployment to maintain fixed exchange rates. By 1929, the global economy was a powder keg waiting for a spark. In the United States, a stock market bubble had inflated to absurd proportions, fueled by easy credit and speculation. When it burst in October 1929, the crash sent shock waves around the world. Banks failed, credit evaporated, trade collapsed, and countries on the gold standard found themselves unable to respond effectively because their monetary policy was constrained by the need to maintain gold convertibility. They could not lower interest rates. They could not print money. They could not stimulate their economies. They could only watch as unemployment soared and output plummeted. Britain, already weakened by 5 years of gold standard rigidity, was hit hard. By 1930, unemployment exceeded 2 million. By 1931, it approached 3 million, nearly a quarter of the workforce. Industrial production fell by 15%. Exports collapsed. The government, following orthodox economic wisdom, cut spending and raised taxes, deepening the depression. Hunger marches wound through London. Shanty towns appeared in parks. Children went without shoes. The Britain that had once ruled the world now struggled to feed its own people. In a comfortable office in Bloomsbury, John Maynard Keynes worked on a book that would eventually revolutionize economics. He was developing ideas about how governments could fight depressions through active fiscal policy, deficit spending, and monetary management. But for now, in 1930 and 1931, he watched with despair as Britain clung to the gold standard even as it dragged the country deeper into misery. He gave speeches, wrote articles, testified before committees. "We are enslaved by a system," he said, "that we no longer understand and that no longer serves us." In New York, in Paris, in Berlin, economists and policymakers watched Britain and drew their own conclusions. Some saw vindication of their doubts about gold. Others insisted that Britain's problem was not the gold standard itself, but the failure to cut wages enough, to deflate enough, to accept enough pain. The debates grew more heated as the depression deepened and the human cost mounted. And in South Wales, Evan Hughes, the miner we met at the beginning, stood in another queue, this one for unemployment relief. He had been out of work for 8 months. His savings were gone. His family survived on charity and the kindness of neighbours who had little themselves. He thought about the men in London who had made the decisions that led to this, the men who had never missed a meal, never wondered how to feed their children, never felt the humiliation of begging for help. He thought about the promises that returning to gold would restore Britain's greatness. He looked around at the hollow-eyed men in the queue with him and wondered what greatness looked like. By the summer of 1931, Britain faced a financial crisis of existential proportions. Foreign investors, looking at Britain's mounting unemployment, its stagnant economy, its political instability, began to lose confidence in the pound. They started converting their sterling holdings into gold, draining Britain's reserves at an alarming rate. The Bank of England, desperate to stop the hemorrhaging, raised interest rates even higher, further strangling the economy. But it was not enough. The gold kept flowing out. The pound was under siege. In September 1931, a new coalition government faced a choice that would have been unthinkable 6 years earlier. Abandon the gold standard or watch Britain's gold reserves disappear entirely. The debate was agonizing. To leave gold was to admit failure, to surrender the symbol of British economic might, to break faith with creditors and bondholders. But to stay on gold was to accept national bankruptcy. On September 21, 1931, Britain left the gold standard. The pound was allowed to float, and it immediately fell in value against other currencies. The announcement sent shockwaves through global financial markets. If Britain, the nation that had invented the modern gold standard, could not maintain it, what did that say about the system itself? And then something remarkable happened. Britain's economy began to recover. With the pound devalued, British exports became competitive again. Industries could sell their goods abroad. Interest rates could be lowered, making credit cheaper and stimulating investment. Unemployment, which had seemed permanently stuck above 2 million, began to fall. Within a year, the economy was growing again. Within 2 years, Britain was experiencing a modest boom. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The policy that was supposed to save Britain, returning to gold, had nearly destroyed it, and abandoning gold, which was supposed to be economic suicide, had saved it. Everything the experts had promised about gold had been wrong. Everything Keynes had predicted had been right. Churchill, no longer Chancellor but still active in politics, privately acknowledged his mistake. He wrote to a friend that his decision to return Britain to gold had been the biggest blunder of my life. He admitted that he had been influenced by Montagu Norman and other financial authorities, that he had not understood the economic complexities, that he had allowed nostalgia and political pressure to override sound policy. It was a rare moment of humility from a man not known for admitting error. But the damage was done. 6 years of unnecessary unemployment, poverty, and social strife could not be undone. The miners who had suffered, the families who had gone hungry, the industries that had been destroyed, these were permanent scars, and Britain's position in the world had been irreparably weakened. The years of economic decline had accelerated the empire's dissolution, strengthened Britain's rivals, and diminished its influence. Other nations learned the lesson too late. One by one, as the Great Depression deepened, countries abandoned gold. The United States held on until 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt finally severed the dollar's tie to gold to free up monetary policy for recovery. France stubbornly maintained gold until 1936, suffering through years of deflation and stagnation before finally surrendering. The international gold standard, which had once been seen as the foundation of civilized commerce, was revealed as a rigid, outdated system unsuited to the complexities of modern industrial economies. The Great Depression would last for years, causing immeasurable suffering, political upheaval, and ultimately contributing to the rise of fascism and the outbreak of World War II. Britain's premature return to gold, while not the sole cause of the Depression, had been an important catalyst, an early domino in a chain reaction of deflationary policies and economic contagion. Churchill's decision in 1925 had helped set the stage for the greatest economic catastrophe of the 20th century. The story of Britain's return to gold is not merely historical curiosity. It is a warning that echoes through the decades, relevant every time policymakers face the temptation to prioritize currency stability over economic reality, prestige over prosperity, nostalgia over pragmatism. The pattern has repeated itself many times since 1925. Argentina, repeatedly pegging its currency to the dollar, only to suffer devastating crashes when reality reasserted itself. Greece, trapped in the Eurozone without control over its own monetary policy, forced into depression-level austerity to maintain currency union. Numerous developing nations, lured by the promise of stability from fixed exchange rates, only to find themselves in debt crises when their currencies proved overvalued. The fundamental lesson is simple, but often ignored. Currencies must reflect economic reality, not dreams of restored greatness. When a country pegs its currency at an unsustainable level, whether to gold, to another currency, or to a regional monetary system, the adjustment will come. It can come through deflation, wage cuts, unemployment, and social suffering. Or it can come through currency devaluation. One way or another, economic gravity prevails. Churchill's mistake was not that he loved Britain or wanted to restore its greatness. His mistake was believing that greatness could be willed into existence through monetary policy, that returning to a symbol of past strength would somehow restore the substance of that strength. He confused the map for the territory, the symbol for the reality. He listened to those who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than those who told him the truth. The elite pressure that drove Churchill's decision also persists. Financial interests still push for policies that protect their wealth, even when those policies harm the broader economy. Creditors still prefer strong currencies and tight money. The wealthy still prioritize stability over growth, predictability over adaptation. And politicians still face the temptation to make decisions that win approval from financial elites, even when those decisions will hurt ordinary workers. The role of nostalgia in policymaking remains powerful and dangerous. Throughout history, nations in decline have sought to recapture past glory through symbolic gestures rather than addressing the hard realities of changed circumstances. The temptation to restore the way things were, rather than adapt to how things are, leads to policies grounded in fantasy rather than fact. Today's central banks operate with far more flexibility than their 1920s counterparts. The lessons of the Great Depression led to fundamental changes in how monetary policy is conducted. No major economy maintains a gold standard. Currencies float. Central banks adjust interest rates to manage unemployment and inflation. The rigid orthodoxies that trapped Britain in 1925 have been discarded. But new orthodoxies have replaced the old ones. New fixed ideas about how economies must operate. New pressures to prioritize certain interests over others. New temptations to pursue symbolic policies that feel right, even when the evidence suggests they will cause harm. The specific mechanisms change, but the underlying pattern, allowing ideology, nostalgia, and elite pressure to override economic reality, remains a constant danger. In 1925, Britain chained itself to gold, and in doing so, it chained its future to disaster. Churchill signed his name to an order he believed would restore British greatness. Instead, it revealed the limits of that greatness, the fragility of Britain's position, and the human cost of economic illusion. Millions paid the price for one decision made in a moment of confidence and nostalgia. The pen Churchill used to sign that order is preserved in a museum now, a small artifact of a large mistake. But the lesson it represents must not be preserved only in museums. It must live in the minds of every policymaker who faces the choice between comforting myths and uncomfortable truths, between the symbols of strength and the substance of strength, between what we wish were true and what actually is true. Because the choice Churchill faced, whether to embrace reality or cling to nostalgia, is a choice every generation must make anew. And the consequences of choosing wrong are always borne by those with the least power to change the outcome.